Okay, what's the real difference between ancient gods and modern cosmology? Now, that might sound like a bit of a strange question to open up with. When you think about ancient myths, we tend to see them as stories, attempts to explain things that couldn't directly be observed. They weren't literal accounts, but symbolic ones. And we usually assume that modern science is nothing like that it moved beyond story, beyond myth, into something concrete, something more solid. But consider this. In ancient myths, gods were used to explain the unobservable. In modern science, we often use equations to explain what cannot be tested. The same function, different language. Now, it's important to understand that I'm not trying to prove a claim here. It's just a comparison that I keep noticing. And I think once you see it, it's hard to ignore. And that's where I think this paper, that sadly I don't think enough people have read, is important. And it's not because it proposes a new cosmology, nor do you have to necessarily agree with the conclusions. It's more because it asks questions that become strangely difficult to ask. It's a paper called Cosmology, Myth and Science, and it was written by Hannes Alfvén, very late in his career. And the important point, I think, is not so much who he was, but where he was standing at the time when he wrote it, inside a system looking back. Now, the paper isn't based on his ideas on cosmology, but instead it's about trying to understand how we've ended up where we are. And I think that question of how we've ended up here, is one that naturally you end up coming to once you start pulling at the assumptions behind modern cosmology. Now, just for those who don't know Hannes Alfvén, he essentially introduced a mathematical shortcut to simplify plasma physics. And almost immediately he recognized the danger. That the simplification hid the very mechanism he was trying to understand. Now, I'm no stranger to Alfvén's work. I came across his work years ago, and I was fascinated by his approach. By adding in a seemingly simple element, he actually made a lot of problems make more sense. But it also asks some deeply uncomfortable questions, and pushed into territory that was in a completely different direction to the mainstream consensus at the time. So, as a result of that, many didn't take him seriously. Even today, it's often considered fringe or exotic, well outside of mainstream, despite him receiving the Nobel Prize for that simplification. The thing is, when you start looking at his work, it naturally leads you to question the assumptions that the standard cosmological model uses, because it still survives today, therefore it must be incredibly robust. So I guess his work in part has inspired me to dig much deeper into the assumptions underlying the Big Bang model. And that eventually, once you do it, leads you to identify these circular loops, where essentially evidence is inferred and that evidence is used as support for other parts of the model. You end up with like a circular reasoning, which is then presented as evidence. And in a sense, that prevents the model from ever being allowed to collapse. And it makes you ask some interesting questions. Why does the data only make sense after you've assumed the model? And why are contradictions smoothed away using new parameters rather than essentially forcing them to ask questions? And I guess most worrying of all, why is it that cosmology seems to be more confident with every step it takes further away from experiment and deeper into abstraction? In Alfvén's paper, he analyzes the problem not through his own eyes, but through the lens of history. And one of the ideas in his paper is something Alfvén calls the cosmological pendulum. And he describes cosmology as swinging between three broad approaches. At one end of the spectrum lies the empirical approach, anchored in observation, constrained by experiment. In the middle lies the mathematical or speculative approach. This is where equations lead, and in a sense, reality is expected to follow. And then at the other end is the mythological approach. This is where answers are only supplied to questions that observations can't actually reach. And I think what's important to realize is that it's not that these three stages are historical. You don't move from one to the next to the other. They're modes, and you can drift between them, switch between one and the other. Now let's just pause and remember that rather strange question I asked at the beginning. We like to think that science and cosmology is firmly in that scientific mode. But I think if you listen carefully to the language that they use, to the types of questions and how those questions are answered, you realize that something else is creeping in. And it's not gods or myths, but it's a narrative that explains the unobservables with an almost absolute confidence. Whether it's the creation event, invisible components, or unfalsifiable claims about history that we can never ever see. And I would argue that it's almost harder to see that shift today than it was in Alfvén's time. Now, you might argue that with increased precision, that essentially has wiped many of those doubts away. But I would argue that increased precision is doing something far more dangerous. If your framework is circular, then more precise data doesn't break that circle, it tightens it. Anomalies don't trigger re-examination, they trigger recalibration, or worse, patches, which inevitably contain untested science and are simply accepted as truth, because unless we do, the entire framework collapses. So through that process, the model absorbs the shocks and, in a sense, emerges more confident than ever. That's not falsification, that's insulation. Now, I get that some people might have a knee-jerk reaction to that. The idea that modern science is creeping into mythology. That's something connected with superstition. But if you think about it a little more deeply, myths are not about being wrong. They're defined by how explanations function. They answer questions that cannot be tested in a way that feels complete. So when cosmology tells us what happens before an observation is possible, and there is no conceivable way of checking, we should at least be honest about what kind of an explanation it is, even if it's wrapped in equation. In Alfvén's paper, he warned that there was a tendency to drift towards this. But I think what you see today is much closer to what I would call a lock-in. The financial investment, the infrastructure, the educational pipeline, the career risks all reinforce a single framework. And that's not because it's unquestionably true. Rather, it's the only allowed one to mature. So it's obvious to see when new data contradicts expectations, what happens next. If we question our assumptions, then we're doing science. If instead we add new parameters, well, we're doing speculative modelling. On the other hand, if we explain contradictions away as a misunderstanding or noise, or worse, new physics is assumed without evidence, then we're drifting somewhere else. And this is what's, I think, unfolding before our eyes at this very moment. We're witnessing this movement firsthand. That's why I think this paper is worth reading and then rereading. It allows us to step outside of what we accept and analyse the patterns as they're happening. And I think what Alfvén was really pointing out wasn't a battle between science and myth. It was a quiet exchange of formalism. Physical cause exchanged for mathematical necessity. Empirical tension for internal consistency. Nothing dramatic happens. No lines were crossed. The theory essentially continues to predict as normal. The equations keep working, but the underlying emphasis has shifted away from reality back into itself. And that's when the collapse into myth occur. It's not that science is rejected. No, it's because it's redefined. The language of science remains, the maths remains, and the most important part of the authority remains as well. What quietly slips away are the constraints, the ones that limit how far an explanation can go without test, without mechanism, or the possibility of it being wrong. In that sense, cosmology, it's not abandoning science, it's almost governing in its name. Each new accommodation is something they call progress. Each unanswered question is deferred. And I guess because the change is so slow and so subtle, it's almost impossible to say when it happened. The floor is slowly shifting beneath everyone, and essentially we're moving with it without realizing what it means to have moved from one stage to the other. That, I think, is the danger Alfvén was warning about.